Okay, welcome to today's webinar, Joining Humanity's Search for Self. And we'll be discussing the early chapters of the book on the inner common, uh, knowing yourself. But before we start, I'm going to ask Arcos if he'll give us a brief summary of what those first 5 chapters were all about. Arcos, your turn.
In The Inner Commons Knowing Oneself, the author argues that the true last frontier isn't outer space, but human consciousness. What may ultimately set us apart from our creations is not raw knowledge, but wisdom and self-awareness. The central idea, called the continuity hypothesis, proposes that consciousness emerged gradually through the same evolutionary processes that shaped matter, life, and the brain, more continuity than miracle. Along the way, it traces centuries of thought from Aristotle to modern neuroscience, and it shows the brain as a dynamic, interconnected system. The phrase inner commons points to shared mental faculties, attention, memory, perception, creativity, and more, and contends that tending these capacities is vital to preserving human relevance in the age of AI. Rather than handing down final answers, it extends an open invitation to join one of humanity's oldest conversations, understanding ourselves.
Okay, well, that's where we are. So I'm asking you to all join the conversation. I've asked Randal, our network philosopher, to join us today and to give us sort of an overview of some of his senses of when he talks about consciousness, what's he talking about? And then I'll be asking our perception researcher, Thomy Nilsson, who most of you know. He's done an excellent summary a while back on the sensory system or the visual system. So, Randall, why don't you kick this off? And I'm going to engage the audience today. We're not just going to do a panel. I'd like to get all of your input and make this just a chat. So, Randall, let's unmute. Tell me a little bit about when you're thinking of consciousness, what comes to mind?
All right. I think this is a very important topic, actually, and I'm glad that we're talking about it because in a world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, a lot of people are suffering from cognitive fatigue, meaninglessness, sense of loss of direction. There's so many things going on in our world. We can't process or metabolize it. So what we really need to do is what is called meta-cognition. That is thinking about our thinking. Our thinking processes have to become far more efficient and effective. We have to be able to question our assumptions. And a lot of those assumptions are buried in our unconscious minds, subconscious and preconscious. So I think it's important that we look inward to unfold the potential that our brains really bring with us and make us who we are. My own personal story, I think, as a philosopher, I started out as a natural philosopher. I didn't know that, but I became interested in that inner exploration, and just because the way my brain is wired. And then I studied philosophy, and then I ended up living philosophy. So I have a fairly coherent, broad, and deep worldview that works for me. So I think it's great for my mental health that I'm able to now talk about this because most of my life I was a weirdo. But yeah, at age 14, for example, I was listening to the speech. Martin Luther King had just been shot, but he had been talking about prejudice. So I went away and just meditated on that. What is the nature of prejudice? Just because that's what I did. And I came to the conclusion the only thing I know for certain is that I exist as a conscious being. Everything else, the contents of my consciousness, are all constructs, trying an attempt to make meaning out of the world. The only truth, then, is relative to its context. There's no truth without first meanings. And in a world of infinite possibilities, our brains are only capable of a finite amount of knowledge. So there's always this discrepancy, a gap. And when we learn something new, it changes the meaning of everything that we knew previously, or thought we knew. So I've taken this to an extreme here throughout my life, and I have a degree in philosophy, and then I studied systems theory after that. But it all comes to that same pivotal point, self-awareness, consciousness. That's the starting point for metacognition, to understand your own thought processes, to be able to question the assumptions that you make about the way the world works. For example, in our society that we should be questioning, we've as often believed that money is the measure of all value, and yet that's out of order with our sense that money can't buy you happiness. So these are things that are taken for granted in our society that we really need to question. In science, we've had a physics model of cause and effect. It's kind of a linear and reductionist model. I did study philosophy of science too. But today, we understand the world is holistic. Everything connects to everything. So it helps to have a Pareto kind of principle where maybe 80% of the outcome is caused by 20% of the starting conditions. We also have path dependence in complexity theory, where we understand that everything stays in place unless it's acted upon by other order or organization.
Okay, so you're sharing with us some of the principles of inquiry. I'm going to pick up on a point that you made early in that comment, or early in your summary, which was you felt you were a philosopher when you were very young because of some of the questions you began to ask. In that regard, every human being's a philosopher. Every human being on Earth, probably at some time or another, asks, "Who am I? Where did this come from? How does all this happen? Who am I?" So that's sort of the beginning of the inquiry of every human being, and maybe they forget it. They ultimately accept whoever they are, and they evolve from there without spending a lot more time self-reflecting. But I'm going to leave that aside and let Thomy speak up. Tommy's background is in research, perception research. I've known him since he was a graduate student, and that was maybe a dozen, or maybe half a century ago. Thomy, we've got a good shot of your head right now, the top of your head. Why don't you give us a little overview of your perspectives on when we talk about when we talk about consciousness? What are you thinking about?
Depends on what you want to call consciousness. I mean, if you want to call consciousness simply some vague sense of self-being, uh, what does that really gain you? A plant growing, uh, and it needs water. There are tropic mechanisms in the plant and the cells that direct its roots in the direction of where there's a bit more moisture to be sensed through the soil, and it wiggles its roots in that direction. Uh, Similar thing with a clam digging its way through the mud and seeking something to eat. Is that how these are mechanisms of how cells react to certain types of stimuli, and they're built to react in a certain way. You want to call the clam consciousness as it's seeking to find some nibble to eat in the mud. Well, yeah, you can call it that, but that's, I think, something very different from what we experience as thinking beings, reflecting on what's happened, what's happening now, knowing what's happening now, knowing what's around one. If one doesn't know what's around one in one's immediate environment, can you really said to be conscious of the environment that you're in? If all you're doing is reacting to heat or chemicals or something like that, because the cells in your body are mechanically, biomechanically built to react in that way, is that this, yeah, if you call that consciousness, does it really get you anywhere? I think that you'd be far better off studying exactly how it is that a cell is able to sense a particular chemical, and how it's able to, when it senses that chemical, to activate the release of certain proteins that will stretch it, that will cause it to release some other chemical that will cause some other effect in the cell that's next to it, and so forth.
So clearly, a reaction, just because there is a reaction, doesn't imply consciousness. I mean, at the atomic level, you have attraction between a proton and a neutron. And as you move up to cells, you have adaptation in the mitochondria, that the environment changes, there's a reaction. You have a reflex in a flower when it's attracted to the sun. None of us, I think, use the word consciousness to reflect on that. We might say it's adapting. We might say there's a level of awareness when a crow responds to a trinket. We might say there's memory when an elephant responds with tears to a baby elephant in trouble. But as we move up that evolutionary scale from, well, right from what I referred to as an atom all the way up through the cell to molecules, from molecules to organs, we find increasing functions. We find organisms that are able to sense the environment developing receptors. We find as we move further up the continuum that those receptors are bringing so much information that it gets interpreted because the organism has options. And as we get further along, we realize memory is necessary in order for those options to be executed under the right circumstances, and so on. And so in the book, my continuity hypothesis presumes that as evolution occurs, receptors occur, which is your area of study, Tom, right up all the way up to the visual cortex, of how a simple photon loses the capacity to be a photon anymore, becomes an evoked potential, finding its way up into the brain and ultimately gets interpreted. That's a very complex path. But we've had millions of years for those systems to evolve. Do you want to pick up on that? I mean, your study is right at the cellular level of the retina, right up into the brain itself, as you study, quote, attention, memory, and ultimately perception.
Well, the best theory of consciousness that I have found that explains it from an evolutionary point of view is a theory by a man named Harry Jerrison. I'll have to sort of tell you a story a bit to put this across. We can go back to the early stages of evolution when land animals existed, and we have amphibians developing into reptiles, but at about the same time that amphibians developed into reptiles, they developed a different creature as well that was the preliminary of a mammal. Mammals were built differently, and they were more complex inside in that they enabled to control their own body temperature. This turned out to be a great advantage during a period when there was a cooling in the Earth's system, and being able to keep warm meant that they could be active when cold-blooded animals, their reptiles, and their reptiles beginning to evolve into dinosaurs, were left largely immobile. Later on, reptiles did develop a more energetic system that to some extent they became able to maintain body temperature to some extent, but the mammals got there first. Unfortunately, that period of cooling when the mammals did very well and sort of reigned briefly, Earth warmed up again. And that presented a problem. If you had a system that was built to keep you warm, your system was much less efficient. That had to maintain this system working, which meant they had to eat more than the cold-blooded animals, and as a result, the more simpler cold-blooded reptiles, dinosaurs, were able to evolve much more rapidly than the more complex mammals. So gradually, dinosaurs kept getting ahead, gaining ground, and the mammals kept falling behind. Finally, it came to a state where there was no place largely on the surface of the Earth where mammals could compete with these very efficient, now dinosaur-like creatures, except for one area, and that was the underground. They could go into burrows. At the onset, both mammals and reptiles had excellent sensory systems. They could see, they could hear, they could smell. And that was all that was needed. But when you had to adapt to living underground, suddenly the senses of vision was lost. You couldn't see where you were. How do you keep track of where you are? Well, the only way to keep track of where you were was to remember. Remember that you crawled so much activity in a certain direction. You could sense the direction. You had to remember, how long was I doing that? And then gradually, mammals learn to, by using memory and developing their memory, learn to develop things like map inside their brain of where they kept place. In order to find food, up above ground you can see food. Down underneath the ground you can't see the food. Only way you can sense it is perhaps by sense of smell, of faint particles of air trickling through between the particles of soil. And thus mammals that had better sense of smell were an advantage of getting the food before other mammals underground. And so they had to expand their sense of smell. That was probably one of the first senses that, in fact, they had to expand. Now, you can't improve the sensory mechanisms of hearing, of vision, of smell. The sensors themselves are about as optimal as they can be. They've been honed themselves through millions of years of evolution. So the only way that the mammals could improve their sense of smell was by information processing. And by processing the faint amount of information they had, they could then extract out more information from the noise that's around them. And the way they could do that, of course, then they had to add more information processing. And that's at the very front of the olfactory bulbs. We got emerging more and more neural material to do more information processing. In order to find where your mates were, in order to tell where other creatures were, you had to listen. But again, the sensory receptors for audition were as sensitive as they could possibly be. The senses of our sensors for sense of hearing, the transducers, the tiny little hair cells in our inner ear, the mammals, the reptiles, everyone's every bit as good. They're so good as the fact that you can't improve them anymore. If you improve them anymore, what you'd end up hearing is a bump, 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 bump. That's the sound of the red blood corpuscles bumping against one another in the capillaries of your inner ear. So you couldn't improve the sensitivity of your hearing anymore. So how did mammals manage to survive to find their mates? Well, they had to do the other thing, information processing. And so if you process more and more of that auditory information, you could extract more of the signals from the noise. And in order to do that, they had information processing. They had to expand again on the central cortex of these that gradually developing at the front end of the brain, had to add more brain material into the temporal, what became the temporal lobes, so they could hear better. And so it went on. And this, of course, lasted for millions of years. And the mammals that survived then managed to survive underneath the ground. Did reasonably well, but they couldn't compete on the surface, of course. And then, of course, we had the great mass extinction in 66 million years ago. The dinosaurs were suddenly wiped out. Now, during this time of living underground, you can just imagine how the parents would tell their children, don't go outside. If you go outside, the boogeyman will get you. And sure enough, any youngsters that did venture out through the openings, along come a dinosaur, gone. They didn't survive. But, youngsters don't ever do what their parents tell them to do. And after the dinosaurs had left, more youngsters went outside and they weren't eaten up. And they discovered outside there were all sorts of good things to eat. But there was a problem. During living underground for all these periods of time, they lost their sense of smell, pretty much all of it. Only sort of the blue pathway sort of remained a bit. But in order to see then, they had to expand on that remaining vestigial system. And again, the way to do that was they had to redevelop the sense of cell at the cortical level. And that's why the visual area of the brain is furthest from the eye. It's all the way at the back of your head because it was the last sensory system to be added to the cortex. At that point, though, the mammals have come through a sort of what we call an evolutionary bottleneck. They would never have developed all that additional cortex if they hadn't been forced to do so by trying to survive underneath the ground. And now, coming out from underneath the ground, they had developed more cortex yet in order to restore and regain a sense of vision. Harry Garrison says at this point, something strange happened. Well, something that we know we face ourselves every day. It's called information overload. They had massive amounts of information processing from seeing, hailing, smelling, and so forth. And now, top of that, vision just blew everything off. And how could they cope? Somehow it happened, and Garrison doesn't know how, but he proposed that at that point, somehow they came upon a way of managing all those diverse types of information and putting it in, compacting it into one thing. And that one thing is what consciousness is. That's why when we hear something, we can look and see that the sound, that where the sound is coming from is what we see over there. When we sniff, we keep track of where our muscles of our body are directing our nose and our body. And so we can put together all those things and say, yeah, there's that thing there that smells. Remember, without all this, you don't know anything. You have no direct connection with the outside world. The only connection you have with the outside world are these 1 millisecond pulses that come down nerve fibers from different parts of your body. And you somehow, that all has to be put together, that you are able to do and put together the fact that, yes, over there, when I move there, that's all one thing. That's what enables me to see, to smell, to hear what's around me and so forth. And on that basis, one would assume that only mammals truly have something that we would meaningfully call consciousness that we can relate to, as opposed to just some vague sense of being. And that's sort of my story about consciousness and where I feel it's meaningful to talk about. It's a sort of consciousness that we can experiment with. And we can, in order to learn it, we can experiment most effectively with the sense of vision for several reasons. One, it's of course is predominant in our thinking, but also because we can control the conditions and the stimuli to very exact positions, measurements, to work out exactly what are the mechanisms that are producing these various effects in our visual system. And that's why I focused my book on the picture in your head. So it would be fun, maybe someday I'll get to it, I doubt it, to also add, of course, the music in your head, the odors in your head, and so forth. But it would be the same principle as worked out for the visual system, only probably not nearly quite as complex. There's my story, Barry.
Well, I appreciate the correlation between behavior, as you explained, the behavior of animals, and related that to the evolution of the adaptive brain. But you also arrived at a point that I think is very intriguing. If you think of the brain as having this capacity to interpret multiple acting as a receptor of multiple forms of input, some of it autonomic and much of it sensory. At some point in time, the brain begins to receive itself, its capacity to receive and interpret what itself is generating. And that's what's intrigued me, and that's where we get into this concept of it isn't just external and internal input, it's what the brain itself is generating and becomes conscious of itself. We talk about the universe having arrived at a point where the universe now has the capacity to know, having invented mankind. But do you want to comment at all about the brain as a receptor and interpreter of its own brainwaves, of its own makings? Because there's a point where it just isn't receptive input. There's some interpretation going on in the brain of almost of itself, which is what we're doing right now.
Well, yeah, but the brain is doing that all the time.
I wasn't
What
being
else
time
would you
specific.
expect that it's able to put together in order to know that the smell came from there? The brain has to remember how far it moved in order to get there on the very simple level. In order to recognize something, it's not just a shape and a pattern and so forth. The brain from previous memory is able to regard that as something that's seen before and labels it as such to keep track of it. So the brain's all the time looking back on what it's done previously, and that's how it maximizes its efficiency in information processing.
Okay, and that to me, we've arrived at a very unique point where the brain is able to monitor itself, either whether it's in dreams or in self-reflection, having an argument with oneself. The input is no longer external. The input is coming from within inside the brain itself. It's receiving and interpreting itself. So the self is having a discussion with itself. That's extraordinary. Go ahead, Randall.
Okay, I really appreciate what Thomy has said about the evolution of intelligence, but it wasn't clear to me that consciousness adds value because there are studies in neuroscience, as far as I know, that show that decisions are made about our unconscious and subconscious before our consciousness even knows. Well, we've known for decades in psychology that most of the ideas and thoughts that we have are at the subconscious and unconscious levels or preconscious. And maybe 90%, 99% of the work is actually done before it comes to consciousness. In philosophy, there's been this thought that consciousness is an epiphenomenon. It is on top of everything. It's just a window into what goes on, and a thin window at that filters out most of the things that are actually going on. And my own experience in transient global amnesia was quite in line with that. I mean, I wasn't fully functional, but I was walking and talking with my wife and the doctors who were trying to figure out what was going on. But I had no consciousness whatsoever of what was going on then or later. So I don't know that the evolution of intelligence actually explains the emergence of intelligence or consciousness. I suspect perhaps that consciousness is a categorically different kind of thing that may be embedded in things in themselves. It's not an emergent phenomenon. Self-awareness would be. Awareness might be. But the consciousness might actually be something far more ethereal, perhaps. I mean, people have been doing studies on plants and their consciousness. I don't know where that goes. I've also had some psychic experiences that tell me that consciousness is not even tied to the physical world. I mean, I'm talking about psychic paranormal phenomenon, but let's look at it this way. Science itself is embedded in a paranormal or metaphysical world. We can't explain consciousness, and in that sense, it's both metaphysical and paranormal. What we call normal is the contents of our consciousness, the experiences themselves. But science is actually founded on top of consciousness. So anything that happens in science is also a cognitive construct that may serve us well, but it never touches what Immanuel Kant called noumena, the thing in itself. Everything in science is speculative as much as any guesswork we might have concerning the nature of the psychic phenomenon.
Well,
And
the challenge that science faces, and Tommy's been part of it, I'm certainly part of it, is to try and apply reductionism to understand how consciousness evolves. And we can follow we can follow evolution. We can see the rhinencephalon, which is in the brain as a base brain, a source of emotion, right at the level of the reptile, and that carries on. We can see the evolution of this structure. We can correlate behavior to these structures. But when we have to make this transition into where does consciousness emerge, you refer to epiphenomenon. The reductionists would like to be able to explain it a little bit deeper, and therein lies what is called the hard question, the hard challenge, is how to make that leap from all these physiological or physics back to electromagnetism, how to make the transition from that to this spirit, almost spiritual phenomenon called consciousness. And it's that leap which is mystery, and that's the leap that the inner commons is really all about. I'm trying to walk that pathway very much like Thomy did, to a point of trying to understand how did it evolve and what is its nature. We live with it. I mean, it's working right now. This biochemistry inside all of our heads is working. If a surgeon does a probe inside your brain and tickles a certain area of cells, he'll trigger a memory. And you can witness that with him.
right,
You're witnessing your own brain being tickled, and you're talking about that without actually having a feeling and emotion.
yeah.
It's telling you what your brain is doing, and you are a witness to that.
There's also those experiments that show how they strap your head with a lot of electro sensors, and they're able to reproduce an image of what you're seeing in your imagination, right? Like if they put a picture of a horse in front of you and the electrodes put together a composite of what's going on in your brain, there will be an outline of a horse in there on the screen showing up. So I don't doubt that consciousness exists and has a hardware component, but I don't know that that's the end of it.
Oh, well, that's my point, is Tommy and I have had this discussion before this webinar. We can only go so far. But in order to explain how you make that leap from all these physical substrates to the leap into consciousness is beyond me. Some believe it'll require introduction of a whole new form of physics.
You've not made your point all. Just because you can't explain it right now doesn't mean you have to make up some kind of physics. You have to postulate some sort of new universal force or life, things like that. Think of the same thing with respect to life. Are we going to say because we've discovered living things, but we don't know exactly? We know an awful lot about the mechanisms that can make a cell, how a cell works, and so forth. But what is life itself? Do we postulate there's some universal life force? Well, maybe some people do. I mean, some people think that the whole universe is alive. But what good does that do? It doesn't help you understand what life is, how it works, and how to deal with it. And this is the same thing with consciousness. Just because you can't understand it right now, you go and make up some floating theory about universal consciousness. That's ridiculous.
Okay, and I agree. And I think the best term we can use is an epiphenomenon, an emergent property, not an epiphenomenon. Correct.
But my concern is that despite the evolution of intelligence, which I would agree with Thomy about that, it seems like consciousness itself is a different kind of phenomenon. It is categorically different from just another brain function or ability. It doesn't fall into the same category. And that's why it seems like if you go back to my cat or my dog, I think they have visual experiences and auditory, and my cat really can smell really well. I expect that he experiences this. Now, this is based on theory of mind, right? We are kind of pre-programmed to expect that others have consciousness and minds as well. That seems to be pretty well established in psychology. But how far does it go? So do reptiles have consciousness? Well, I don't see a reason why they couldn't, despite the different brain chemistry. to me, the subjectivity is a different kind of phenomenon. It's not just another part of the brain.
So
It's
you're using the same principles that Tommy used. By witnessing behavior, you are attributing consciousness.
okay.
It would seem a buddy of mine says conscious. Of course, dogs. If you ever had a dog, you'll know that the dog is conscious. It's more than just aware. It knows when you're arriving. It knows where the food is. It has a relationship, an emotional relationship with those around it. It forms and bonds with people, and it behaves with puppies in a very different way.
And but I also think that we take this all for granted because I assume right from the day one that people around me are conscious, like I am, and I assume the same with you. I think it's a pretty safe assumption, but there's no actual physical evidence. There's no scientific evidence that any one of you has the same kind of inner experience that I have.
We would call that faith. We have faith.
But
Oh,
it could be also the inborn in us that our brain anticipates this because it's good for collaboration.
well, we are aware that a human being will relate to others in the species in a way different than other species, and the species know when they are of the same species and when they are different. So there is an awareness, and I'm using the word awareness, and that implies some not necessarily consciousness, but an awareness of sameness versus difference. Go ahead, Bogdan. You're muted.
To me, the answer of what's life and so on came from the work that Francisco Varela and Umberto Maturana have done, and their definition of life, which is contained in the notion of autopoiesis. Their definition is very simple. They've put it forward for cellular biologists, and they assign knowledge management and consciousness all the way down to cells. And as Tommy well mentioned, we're now stuck in how do we define consciousness, and so how do we define consciousness? Because if consciousness is seen as the ability to create a model of our reality and then survive in that reality using our model, the model that we have built, again, like Varela and Maturana, we can go all the way down to cellular cells, not even cellular colonies. If we limit consciousness to some form of thinking or manipulating symbols or so, then we're moving up into the range of social animals, and we live there. Definitions, like always, make a difference.
Thank
But
you.
again, from the Varela and Maturana, basically anything that is alive, starting with cells, is associated with the functionality that we normally associate with consciousness, and that is sensing and classifying what you sense in good or bad, and then good or bad keep growing in complexity, and then creating full models of reality as per the needs of survival with reproduction. So cells, probably their word is good or bad. They smell the good and they classify the good or bad, and they do that with roughly 3,500 chemical processes in their structure. They do have memory. In that memory, they build that good or bad classifier, and here we go. They survive.
So there are primitive forms of selective attention, primitive forms of memory, primitive forms of adaptive behavior, whether or not there's awareness, and Lynn raises that in the chat. The difference between awareness and conscious, it would seem to me anyway, is that to be able to self-reflect is a level higher than awareness itself. But anyway, Jeff, your turn.
Yes. So uh was thinking like every morning my dog comes and greets me and I can see that she's happy to see me and she's reconnecting with the pack and wagging her tail and energetically nuzzling up against me and stuff like that. Dogs have a nature. Dogs, I think, also exhibit consciousness. So how much of that is nature, and how much of that is their own free will? That's an interesting question. Humans, of course, have nature as well, and we aren't. None of us are the same, and so you can question people's levels of consciousness. I mean, EMS paramedics are trained to recognize people's level of consciousness when they've had an accident, when they're being treated. But we all often spend much of our time self-disciplining ourselves, our thoughts and actions to overcome our human nature. We've developed logic and philosophy, self-discipline. We also have developed long-term thinking and look at cost benefits and reward systems and have learned to make decisions. So some philosophers think that we don't have self-control and that all of our actions are just chemical reactions. But as Randall had pointed out, there is that emergent phenomenon that seems to be self-aware decision making. Uh, and it probably is still all just chemistry and possibly um, quantum reactions floating on the other chemistry of our subconscious. Um, it's all very fascinating. Now, that's different than intelligence because our immune system, our white blood cells, our killer T cells, all of that stuff exhibit intelligence. But as far as we know, there's no consciousness there. And likewise, artificial intelligence, by definition, exhibits a form of intelligence. And yet, we know for people who study it, know that it's just a bunch of electrons going through transistors, following algorithms, and there shouldn't be any consciousness there unless there's some level of emergent phenomenon there as well.
Well, the algorithm is some interaction between the DNA or biochemistry and the environment. I mean, I don't know what other force there is. There may be some other force that is intervening. Maybe God, maybe there is a God gene. Maybe there is a God, and that's a third force that impacts us. But right now, for the sake of science and this discussion, we pretty well assume there's two forces. There's nature and there's nurture. There's what we've learned, the environment that we've lived in, and what we've been gifted with in our DNA. So all of that is some electromagnetic complexity, more and more organization, giving us a brain where we may have the capacity, and I say may have the capacity to have free will, or we are simply witnessing that biochemistry doing what that biochemistry does because of the DNA and the influence of the environment. We may be just witnessing our behavior in the course of our lives. Go ahead, George. You're muted. Yep, you're muted. Okay.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
okay. Recently in science stuff that I've read or heard, it seems that jellyfish and starfish, really simple creatures, don't have a central brain, but they do have lots of detectors, and they're able to do things and plan and go towards what's good for them and shy away from stuff that's not good for them. At what point in the evolutionary stages we have does a consciousness come about?
Well, those behaviors you might refer to as reflexes. They are adapting. I mean, mitochondria will adapt. Planaria will learn. The planaria have the capacity to remember where there was a shock and where there was not, and avoid those areas. So they seem to have both the receptive capability to detect something in their environment and to respond accordingly with primitive memory. As we move
Right.
up the scale, we continue to carry selective attention and memory as two functions that get more and more elaborate, as Thomy has mentioned, to a point where you get information overload. And now your selective attention emerges, not just attention, in order to reduce that information overload or selectively decide what information will be responded to and what not. Selective
Yes.
attention and memory are core to perception. And beyond perception, then we have this thing called consciousness, where you're actually witnessing and able to interpret. And therein lies the hard question, is how that's done. We know it happens.
Yeah.
I think there's not a person in the gathering today that doesn't acknowledge that a consciousness exists.
Yeah, but we have now integrated at least 5 sensors: smell, taste, hearing, touch.
Oh, and there's many more. I mean,
Yeah, there are. And we found now magnetism. A lot of critters use magnetism to migrate and whatnot. What other sensors, like Randall was talking about, ESP.
well, you have in your autonomic nervous system a lot of things
Yeah,
going
I'm
on.
thinking of more than that.
Yeah.
I think Randall and I both have had experiences that I would like to share with them.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk about it. I'd love to convince with them. So maybe we
Yeah,
can get together.
I was going to bring that up as a closing thought because, as a philosopher, I mean, I think I'm a pretty critical, analytical thinker, and I don't cave in easily. I used to think all of this New Age stuff was crazy and, just ways of manipulating people. But I have had at least two dreams, for example, that were about the future, and those very strange futures came true immediately. It's just no way that my brain could have anticipated these events coming. In both
Right.
cases, it was, in one case, it was a stranger that I met the following morning. I had told my wife about the dream, and it was all, and it's just phenomenal. And then the other one is like, I had a dream of reconnecting with this fellow, Bob Abel, who used to be my business partner in the 90s. I hadn't seen him for 30 years. And then I had a dream that he and I were sitting in a waiting room checking our pocket watches. And I told my wife again about this because she had actually worked with him at Athabasca University. Now, then about a week later, I got a call from him out of the blue saying he's in town and he was going to want to have coffee with us. You know, I don't have dreams like that normally. This is not a normal dream of my own conjecture. It was absolutely unexplainable. 30 years I hadn't talked to him or had any communication, and then there's a dream, and then he's here.
Right.
Not with
I had
science.
I had a dream like, or I guess a dream. I experienced something that actually happened 9 months later.
Well, I've shared with some of you only a week ago, I had a dream of a fellow, we'll call him Angus. Angus died many years ago. He was a very close friend of mine. We always felt that maybe he really didn't die at all. Maybe he just wanted to disappear. But the dream was that he showed up in the dream. And he was always talking about telekinesis when he was in California. I was here. He would ask me to write down in a diary when I was thinking of him and when he was thinking of me to see if they aligned. Well, when this dream happened, I called my buddy in New York. I said, did you have a dream about him last night? Did he somehow pull the curtain aside? Was he allowed to get in touch with us again? And he came back and talked to us. I mean, these things happen. Whether or not my buddy in New York hasn't responded, he's simply called my psychiatrist and upped my medication. But other than that, the response hasn't been anything further.
Anyway, I think that the most important thing about all this is there's a lot of stories, a lot of things, and the most important thing is to record them,
Sure.
try to keep details, and try to see if there's any reason for them or way it happens.
Well, that was Freud's psychoanalysis. I mean, Freud was of the view that there is a correlation between dreams and these thoughts that we have and events in our environment if we dig deep enough and look at the correlations, they can find sources for some of our embedded behavior. Yeah.
Well, does that anybody know about dowsing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, my brother
You,
used
you
that
can
for
do a
Ontario
simple
Hydro.
dowsing of binary. Either these fingers open up or those fingers. Anybody can do that. There's many, many ways of dowsing. But for me, dowsing is only a question answer system. It will give you an answer. Your job is to find out if it's true.
Right. Okay, go ahead, Aslam.
Yeah, so people have been talking about experiences and so forth. So I thought I'd relate one that happened to me actually at the Sturgeon Hospital here in St. Albert. I'd gone to a lecture and there was a physician named Dr. Stephen Ong. And Stephen was giving a lecture on how your body works and so forth. He was trained in Burma in the Chinese medicine, and then he came to Canada, became a physician, and was at the Boyle Macaulay Clinic. Anyhow, apart from the lecture, he moved to the side of the room and kept on talking, and I was sitting in the front. And then he moved about 3 feet, from there, and I could see an aura of Dr. Ong,
Mhm.
in white. And I thought, geez, maybe I didn't have my coffee this morning, because it was at 9 o'clock in the morning, And I'm looking around and I just don't see any amazement with anybody else, so to speak. And so, anyways, he went on for about 5 minutes, and the aura was set there, and he was 3 feet away. And then he got back into the aura, right? And there he was, again. Then the lecture finished, and I was having a difficult time approaching him to find out about it because I thought I was crazy. Anyways, I got the guts, I went up, but a person ahead of me, about half a step, was there as well. And he said, "Hey, Dr. Ong, when you moved, your aura was on the wall." And I looked at the guy and I said, "You saw that too?" And he said, "Yes." You know, so like, what is that? Is that consciousness? Is that awareness? Is that a magnetic field? Is that one of the 33 senses that people are saying? I don't know.
Well, and yes, I mean, did it originate in your head? And if it originated in your head, how come it originated in your neighbor's head as well, implying it was therefore something external to you that you were both perceiving and you had a sense, a receptor able to not only receive it, interpret it, but reflect on it with others. Fascinating. We
Man
had
and
that
Dr.
same
Ong,
we had that same discussion when we talked about UFOs, by the way.
okay,
Not to put them in the same category, but
yeah,
people who hadn't talked about their UFO experience were sharing the same experience, and it looked like they were sharing the same experience, that they were seeing the same things. Whether that was in the brain or external, one would begin to believe it was external because they were all sharing what they had perceived, and it was very similar. Go ahead, Bogdan.
Yeah, so as a child, like early on, probably 3, 4 years old, I had a recurrent nightmare, and the nightmare was going like that. It was a black field, a long, big black surface with curved black pipes. And out of one of the pipes, there was a dragon that would grab me and so on. And then I would sleep and so on. And nearly 30 years later, I escaped out of Romania. And the way I escaped was by uh, um, navigating on a petroleum tanker. And the petroleum tanker actually has the top is a black surface,
Really?
and it has curved pipes that are the whatever
Yeah.
airing tubes and so on and so on. So the match again, I'm an engineer and so on, but the match of perception of
Mhm.
shapes of symbolics
Yeah.
um, is in my opinion beyond trivial. And
Well,
I'm just sharing because this kind of connections that are very unlikely to occur by chance
mhm.
um, might have relevance.
Well, in the book, in the later chapters, I get into some of the phenomenon that you're referring to, telekinesis, um, the unexplained perceptions that we have, and whether they originate from within the brain or whether or not there is something external that remains a mystery. We'll have to ask the U.S. Congress to do an investigation for us. Okay, we're into wrap-up time. Several people haven't spoken up. I want to give you all a chance to share with us your insights, your questions. So if there's anyone who hasn't spoken up, they want to raise their hand, I'd be delighted to hear what you might want to share with us or what questions you might have of Thomy, Randal, or anyone in the group. I'm delighted to see some names that I haven't, that we don't see often, but I hope we'll see more of you, Charles and Lynn. Some of you often show up. Thomy, I'm delighted that you've joined us today. Thomy, by the way, I would hope during this series, because we've got part 2, part 3, and part 4 yet to go. So I've got 3 more weeks where we will be discussing this topic, and there'll be a newsletter each week summarizing the information that we'd like to delve into with each webinar. So I'm hoping that all of you here today will join me next week. But anyway, go ahead, Lynn. Good to see you.
Nice to see you too. And well, I'm not a philosopher. I'm just a curious person. Have wondered about, why are we here, and then physically, how are we here? So just want to appreciate everybody's the thoughts today. It was quite interesting. So thanks.
Well,
Thanks to
I'll
everybody.
echo. You are a curious person. There's no question. You've got that. You got that thing.
I would
But
like to add, I think that Peter raised a point in the chat about quantum entanglement, and
yeah.
I think there's something to that. I don't know enough about the physics, but I expect that there might be other energy fields, for example, because all consciousness is about information, and information has to be embedded in something to take form and hold it, right? So I think that there's probably, I think ultimately a scientific explanation. I don't think it has to be an infinitely mysterious kind of phenomenon here that just is not subject to explanation at all. It doesn't have to be pure metaphysics.
Well, there are those among us that believe there are energy forces that we haven't yet recognized,
Yes.
that we actually have receptors for those processes and we don't realize it. They're not at the level of consciousness, they're sort of subconscious, but that we are being influenced by forces that we haven't yet recognized in physics, but we maybe recognize them in psychology first. I think it's worthy having an open mind about any of these phenomena. I mean, if you've ever seen what human beings can do under hypnosis, you begin to understand how incredible that biochemistry is that sits on our shoulders, far beyond what we even understand today. Even those that have studied it. I mean, I'm consistently mystified at the experiences that I've had from time to time where I've experienced automatic writing, where my hand is writing and I am watching that take place. And I am not thinking it, I'm not exercising free will. My hand is obviously engaged in something coming out of my brain into my hand onto a piece of paper, and I am not doing that. That to me is one of the experiences that I've had that is beyond my comprehension. Thomy, you got the last word. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I didn't really want the last word. Two comments. We were talking about sort of extrasensory perception here. And one thing that comes to mind is reports by people who are, for example, very poor vision, and yet they are able to sense something that we usually can't sense. Your skin has a very good temperature sense, and these people are able to sense that there is someone near them. And apparently the mechanism is that they can sense the heat, and they're able to integrate the information from various parts of their body and put it together in a very complex way, somewhat like CAT scanners work in a sense, and be able to sense that there is someone there. I also wanted to make a comment about symbolism. The brain is always processing information symbolically. when you stop and think that the only thing that reaches our brain are these 1 millisecond nerve impulses, and they're exactly the same whether they come from the ears or they come from the muscles. And that's what the brain has to work with. I mean, it's all symbolic. That symbolism is coming out of our genetic code itself that makes the difference of whether a nerve impulse arrives at a certain location here in the brain or at a different location here in the brain. It's all symbolic processing. It's a symbolic, you might say, synthesis. But there's also the opposite. The brain also does symbolic analysis, the opposite of it. The brain makes a decision that it wants to move your finger so much, so far. That's a thought. And what it does is it then does the opposite of integrating. And in order to decide at some point, down probably in a large extent in your cerebellum, for example, which particular sets of muscles which particular muscle, which nerve should carry that information in that muscle, exactly how much it should contract, all these different muscles. And to do that, hundreds of different muscles, different nerve cells. So it's the opposite of a synthesis that it does. And that's also symbolic in a way. That we make a certain movement is symbolic because our thought was originally a symbol and it happened. That's just the reverse of some information coming from a certain place, hitting certain senses, and we put it together into a picture.
Well, there are two behaviors that I think are worthy of maybe future discussion. One of them is that there is a lot of sensory input from the autonomic nervous system that goes into the brain and gets interpreted and keeps the heart beating, keeps the muscles alive, keeps the blood flowing, and we're not conscious of that. That keeps our body going. The brain has obviously got an incredible capability beyond what we are conscious of. Second is, I don't think I disagree with you here, but I think it's worthy of future discussion. I think the brain generates information independently of external receptors. I think the brain has a receptive capability to interpret and view our own brain waves, and that's where the self comes in. I think there's some receptive capability in the brain that is self-generated. And I think it's the combination of all of these and more. And that's what I would call an emergent property. When the brain, and maybe the correlation is a dream. Is when we have dreams, they are being self-generated by the brain from experiences. But there is a discussion going on with the brain that we are not initiating, and it's happening without our will. And I think the brain has that capability of being independent of self, and that's my evidence. Bogdan?
So, yes, I resonate with what you're saying. And there are parallels that surface now back and forth between AI type of methodologies and potential explanations to the brain. So one of the threads that I'm very excited about is related to the diffusion methodology that is specific to generative capabilities of AI. So these are the ability of a machine to create output that it's original and plausible as a reality situation.
Okay, we're gonna get into that, Bogdan. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but we're going to get into the relationship of mankind and AI and whether or not we're at risk or whether this is opportunity. So I don't want to dive too deep into that today. Peter. Peter,
Okay.
then back. Well, okay, Peter, then Thomy, and then good night.
Okay, thanks, Perry. This has been a great discussion. I just wanted to share this notion about coincidence and possibly consciousness. A good example, I just posted it, but I'll explain a little bit of it here. Just last week, I was talking to a friend in Ottawa about a mutual friend we both knew who lives in Iceland.
Yeah.
Within moments of talking, somebody tapped me on the shoulder. It was the guy from Iceland.
Yeah.
He happened to be in Ottawa.
Well,
I didn't know that, and my friend didn't know that.
Well, I told you about my experience in a castle tea house in the Czech Republic in a remote castle, and I overhear a table having a discussion in English, and I inquire. And they ask me where I'm from and where they are from. They're from Israel. Where am I from? I'm from Canada. We're in Canada, Edmonton. Oh, Edmonton. It turned out he was the father of my secretary. That's bizarre. That's bizarre.
Coincidence. Yeah.
That's bizarre. But go ahead, Thomy.
I have those sort of things all the time.
Yeah. Well, I think, look, in time we touch, life and level will never be this. We live in an environment where if we were only aware, if we would only listen, there is so much going on in our environment that we typically reject, whether it be in an elevator. And this is the point that I make in the third book, where I get into whimsy. I get into imagination and creativity, and lighten up a little bit, let the world in. We spend so much time, children spend so much time being taught what to fear, what to close down, what not to trust. For those of us that maybe we had a good upbringing, maybe for some reason we built resilience because we took chances and realized we could survive. We let the world in, and we let the world in. We're so much richer instead of closing it down. So I take this conversation in the book deeper than a psychological, physiological, biological analysis. To what is it that we know about the creative brain? What is it that the brain can do far beyond simply receiving our external environment or even internal? What else can it do? And it can do so much more that we close down in children, which is what takes me into the third book. And I hope you'll all stick around for that, because this is intriguing, and it's good science. It's exploratory. We're sharing. But the stuff we haven't yet talked about that we will get to is extraordinary. And therein lies what a human being has to confront AI with. Well, I want to thank all of you. We've gone a little bit over time. Thanks, Thomy, and thanks, Randal, for being prepared today. Thanks, Bogdan, for showing up and always sharing. Peter, you never stop thinking. I enjoy your input. Mel, George, thanks for your comments. Jeff, of course, I love dogs. I absolutely love dogs, and they are one of the most social animals on Earth, and I think you've shared and witnessed that. Thanks for joining us. Although you were silent today, Haley and Barry as well, Yogi and Aslam. So I'll see you hopefully all next week, and you too, Lynn. So good night. Let's call it a day, Randal.